look at how the tables have turned. 10 years ago, if you told a philosophy major they needed to learn to code to stay relevant, um, they would have literally like rolled their eyes, right? I think a lot of it is if you look at where we are in 2026, the joke is actually on us because philosophy majors now, according to a new report, have lower unemployment rates than computer science majors in the United States. When I read that headline or read that article, I was like, what? Mm, I don't know. Can we just like let that sink in for a second? The people who spent their college years, debating the nature of reality and the limits of knowledge are now more employable than the people who spent their time writing code. Mm, and big tech is hiring them en masse, right? So let's like dive into it. If you're new here, I'm Shay. I'm your chief critical thinking officer and also a PhD candidate at Harvard. And this is critical thinking in the age of AI. Okay, so I think today we need to talk more about how we're positioning the humanities in the age of AI because my argument has always been the humanities are not a luxury, it's a necessity. We need it beyond just ivory tower. And there's something fundamentally critical to what the humanities teach us that necessitates its ongoing teaching and engagement by everyone, not just, once again, people in the academy. And honestly, I want to be more clear here because um, the humanities is not about becoming a philosopher, right? It's not about, a very narrow vocation, although I do believe some people are called to the higher vocation of being a humanist. I consider myself a humanist. But en masse, I feel like we need to expand how we talk about the humanities because it's not about becoming a historian or literary critic or even a professor, right? I think it's about learning how to think, right? I always say if you want to learn how to think critically, think like a historian. I'm an intellectual historian. I love the work I do. I love the methodology and the historiography and everything that we do in order to get a deeper understanding of what it means to be human, right? And learning to think is one of the most useful skills you will ever have, right? Because we're at the point, right, where AI can write code, it can analyze data quite well. Obviously, depending on the data, because I know some of my researcher friends have a lot to say about that. Um, but yeah, it's getting to the point where it's generating art and music and poetry. Um, but it cannot think critically about the implications of that code or that data or that thing that it is producing, right? And I'm not getting into the AI consciousness debate here, but it cannot ask why. It cannot question its own assumptions. It cannot recognize its own biases. And I think that is where we as humanists, as people who teach in the humanities, that's where we come in, right? Let's even take Anthropic, for example. So their Claude models are some of the most advanced, AI systems in the world right now. And they have a document that they call their like soul document, um, or like their constitution. I disagree with the use of the word constitution. That's a whole separate episode, an article to be written. But they have a constitution for their AI that builds on sources as diverse as, you know, Immanuel Kant and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and is drawing on these humanistic documents to govern something that's non-human, right? And part of it is because they actually want their AI to align with human values. And in order to do that, you have to draw on humanistic philosophy and principles, right? So I think to recognize the full scope of what we're seeing here is that more and more companies are actually clamoring for the humanists because they add a certain level of critique and understanding and knowing that their systems, they're acknowledging it, that their systems just do not have. And then the greater question is, can we even encode those things? That's once again a whole nother debate. Um, or let's even look at Google DeepMind. I think Google DeepMind, is actually a really good example of this phenomenon because they have a whole entire AGI department, like people who are studying from a social scientist, humanities, and economics background. What happens if we achieve AGI? What does that do to society? What does it do to our economy? What does it do to the future of work? Like they already have that built out because we shouldn't wait for it to be, on the horizon in order to start studying it, right? Um, and once again, the role of the humanist, the role of the philosopher, is to carve out the realm of imagination and critical and ethical engagement with what this technology will mean for all of us, right? And that in and of itself is a vocation. Now, I know what some of you guys would think it. Once again, that's why I've been subtly hinting at, humanities as a vocation versus humanities that's universally, applicable. You're like, Shay, we need electricians. I agree. We need plumbers. I agree. We need builders. I agree. We need people who can fix things and make things and keep the lights on. And you are absolutely right. We do need those people. And here's the thing, we can't allow those same people to be outside of our realm of influence when it comes to thinking critically about the systems that they are building. We need electricians that are conscious about the data centers they're building. We need uh, those who are building houses to be critical of the materials in which they're using to build these houses, right? Like it's not something that is a either or situation. And I want us to once again think of the humanities as not something that's mere book knowledge, but it's something that's instrumental to how we think as human beings. And honestly, like, let me give you more examples. Like, or no, actually, let me do this. Let me pose this question. I know you guys hate it when I don't have a full script. I'm sorry. I'm just going off the riff, but these are how my voice notes are. If you want me to go back to scripting, I'm very happy to do that. But um, this is what I want to pose to you. Why can't a trade school curriculum include a module on the history of labor movements? Right. So why can't an electrician understand the ethical implications of the smart grids they are installing and the trade-offs? Why can't a nurse question the biases in the AI diagnostic tools that they're using? Right? So the idea that we have to choose between practical skills and critical thinking, I think is a false dichotomy. And I think it's holding us back from having more comprehensive conversations about the future of work. Let me know if that is making sense. Because I know, like, going off the roof here. But I was having a conversation with a friend about this, and I always give the example of no, like, let's actually extrapolate. Let's think out loud together about this. Let's say you have um a welder, right? Um, and the welder spends their days working with metal and fire and like other precision tools. I remember actually learning a lot about welders in that show, How Things Are Made. I used to watch that a lot as a kid because I was just endlessly curious about how things are made. Sorry, side note. See, look, this is why I should be scripting because I will go on multiple tangents, and then you guys will say you can't follow my logic. What was I saying? Yeah, so let's say you have a welder. Now imagine that same welder also has a background in philosophy. They understand the concept of justice. They understand, uh, the history of workers' rights. They understand the ethical implications of their work. Do you think that welder would be more likely to advocate for better working conditions? You know, do you think they'll be more likely to question unsafe practices? Yeah. Like, you know what I mean? They'll be more likely to innovate in ways that benefit not just their employer, but also their community. And I think that's a real possibility, right? I think the market is actually demanding humanistic thinking, not just in the ivory tower, but in the factories, in the hospitals, and in the startups, you know? And I think the problems that we are facing today are not just technical. They're ethical, they're social, they're human. And the only way to solve them is with humanistic thinking. So when we talk about the future of work, we can't just talk about trade schools. We can't just talk about the ivory tower. We can't just talk about all these different domains of education. We have to think about it more comprehensively. We have to talk about self-education that includes philosophy and history and literature. We have to talk about a world where everyone, not just a select few, has access to the tools of critical thinking, right? So I think that's why I'm like, oftentimes pushing back on this idea that the humanities are seen as a luxury and it's superfluous. And it's like, why are we spending time on this? Um, and I think part of it actually lies in the rise of neoliberalism. I know y'all don't want to hear this. And it really lies in the rise of neoliberalism and the prioritization of so-called marketable skills, right? I'm not saying there's anything wrong, with wanting to have a job after college. You should want a job and you should have a job that is of a livable wage and a job that can provide for your family. I 110% agree. But I think when there's an overcorrection on that is when we start seeing the mass defunding of humanities departments, right? Because their utility is seen purely in terms of market terms and not in terms of its other benefits, the benefits that you don't always see, like civic engagement, the ability to disagree without being disagreeable, learning how to understand the formulation of arguments so you're not easily, misinformed online. Like, right? Like, those are the benefits that go beyond just whether or not skills are marketable, right? Mm. And now we're actually seeing reverse. That's why I started off, this voice note was like, wow, like, the philosophy majors are more employable now than the computer science majors, right? The market is actually even demanding humanistic thinking now, right? Um, but yeah, ultimately, I know what you guys are thinking. How do we integrate the humanities um, into all forms of education and work? And this is what I'm thinking a lot about. If you're in a technical field, it is very easy to pair your training with some reading in the humanities. Join a book club, start a discussion group, um, engage with a piece of history that you never really had time to delve into in school, right? Like, if you are working on a specific area, what did that look like 100 years ago or 200 years ago? Or how has the concept of that tool or that technology evolved over time, right? I think from an education perspective, like if you're an educator and you're running a trade school or a vocational program, incorporate the humanities into your curriculum, right? Like teach a module on the ethics of technology, on the history of labor, on the philosophy of work. Like, it doesn't have to be taught as an abstract concept, by the way. Like, just to clarify, you can also teach it as a practical skill, like, as something that will make your students better at their jobs and better members of their communities and companies that they work at, right? Like, um, I want to make it as grounded as possible. And look, if there's a lot of policymakers as well that listen to my podcast. If you're a policymaker, fund the humanities education as part of workforce development. That is my argument. I don't think we should treat it as something that's superfluous. If anything, treat it as a core component of any education, because I think when we have the conversations of, future proofing ourselves and our children, critical thinking will always, always be a need. All right. Um, okay, I'm blabbing a lot. So yeah, let me just leave you with this. I believe the future of work is humanistic. The most valuable skills I've always pointed to the World Economic Forum report, other reports that show this. The most valuable skill in the age of AI is not going to be coding. It's critical thinking, right? It's the ability to ask the right questions, to identify the flaws, to adapt to new context, to understand the human implications of the systems that we are all building and are a part of, right? Um, and the good news is, I try to, inject as much hope into my platform as possible. The good news is that it is not limited to those within the ivory tower. It is not something that requires a PhD or a tenure track position. It is something that we can all cultivate, you know, whether it's at work or in our education or in our lives or in our communities. Like, the humanities is not the luxury. Yeah. And we need to stop treating it as such. Yeah. Mm, Glad to be chatting with you guys back again. Um, and yeah, let me know your thoughts in the comments wherever you're listening to this. Once again, the platform is growing a lot. Some people like more structured podcast episodes. Other people just want my stream of consciousness. Let me know which one you are. But yeah, thanks for listening. I'm Shay, your Chief Critical Thinking Officer, and keep thinking critically.